Good evening and welcome to members and officers to the Rochford District Council Review Committee of the 6th of July 2021. Before we go to the meeting, I'll read out the emergency evacuation announcement. Should we be required to evacuate the building, would you please leave the building via the rear doors to the hall. Turn right, go through the 2 sets of double doors to the car park, which is the assembly point. Please do not delay your evacuation to collect any belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission to do so by council staff. Please note that the meeting will be audio recorded. Please would you switch off mobiles or turn them to silent. Members, there are 4 microphones on the tables for use during the meeting, and when I invite you to speak, please wait until there is a microphone in front of you before speaking, as microphones are needed for the hearing loop and for the audio recording. Please, where possible, assist in passing the microphones to each other and use the hand gel and antibacterial wipes on the tables if you do touch the microphones. Members, voting will be done on a show of hands in line with the Constitution. I will ask for a show of those hands for and then against recommendations. Those abstaining from voting will be noted by the officers. We'll move to agenda item number 1, apologies for absence. Apologies for absence have been received from Councillors Ian Foster, Mike Wilkinson and James Newport. Agenda item number 2, substitute members. Councillor Carol Weston is substituting for Councillor Ian Foster. Agenda item 3, non-members attending. We've got Councillors Cheryl Rowe, Simon Smith, Simon Wootton, Dave Sperring, Julie Gooding and Arthur Williams. Agenda item number 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of June 2021. Are those minutes agreed, members? Thank you. Agenda item number 5, to receive declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest, members? Okay, thank you. So moving on to agenda item 6, which is the Treasury Management Annual Review 2020 to 2021. Naomi Lucas, the Assistant Director for Resources, will present the officer's report. Councillor Simon Smith, the portfolio holder for Financial Services, is also in attendance for this item. Naomi.
Thank you, Chair. This report sets out a summary of the Council's Treasury Management activity for the 2021 financial year. The Council is required by the CIPFA Code of Practice on Treasury Management to produce an annual review of its activity each year. And the committee is asked to consider the contents of the report and recommend it for approval to full council on the 20th of July. As I mentioned, the council is required by regulations to undertake an annual review of its treasury management activity. This is the 3rd of 3 reports that the committee receives each year, following its strategy in advance of budget setting, which was on the 11th of February 2020, and then a mid-year update that this committee received on the 15th of December. The report follows its normal format and sets out at section 3 the investment performance for the last financial year. Members will see from the graph at paragraph 3.3 that interest rates have declined throughout the year, and they can see the council's performance in terms of its investments compared to the Bank of England base rates and the LIBOR average rates. Further to that, at section 4, the report sets out the investment position for the council and the amount of cash it's held for investment during the course of the year. The table at 4.3 shows the average sum that was invested throughout the course of the year. I would just note that the balance at the start of the year was unusually high because that's when we had just received a large amount to pay out in terms of business grants in relation to COVID. But most of that was paid out fairly quickly, so you'll see that that kind of average drops quite quickly after the start of the year and then kind of flattens out for the remaining course of the year. Due to the low investment rates that have been achievable this year, the Council's investment returns have totalled £68,000 compared to £147,000 in the previous financial year. That's as a direct consequence of the interest rates that I alluded to previously. Finally, I'd just say that as part of this report, I'm required to confirm that the Council's operated within its Treasury limits and prudential indicators as it's set out in the Treasury Management Strategy. So I'd just like to draw members' attention to that fact. So I don't think there's anything else that I was going to add, unless anyone's got any particular questions they'd like to raise.
Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Through you, I'd like to ask the officer to expand on some of the information that I believe we have requested in this report previously, and that it seems to be absent unless I've misread it, and apologies if I have. Item 4.2 deals with the breakdown of investments. I'm assuming, and perhaps the first assumption the officer can confirm if I'm correct, that the £6 million placed with Handelsbank and the 2 million in the Prime Monetary Fund are on demand. Could you confirm that, because it's not stated?
Yeah, the amount placed with Handelsbanken is instant access, and again with the money market fund, that's instant access.
Yeah, I think that needs to be made clear. But my concern of what we've requested before is that the interest rates and the terms for the fixed money is put into the report. We've got 3 different fixed rates with Santander. There's no information on the length of the terms or the interest rates that the council is achieving. There's one with Lloyds, again, no interest or length of the fixed rate term. And I think it would be helpful to have that included in the report if you're not able to give it to us tonight.
Okay, thank you for the comments. I would just say, I think as I've explained to committee members previously, that this is just kind of a snapshot of the position at year end, and the kind of terms of the investment in terms of the interest rate earned will vary throughout the year. So it really depends on an individual day in terms of the interest rate that might be earned on a particular investment. So I could obviously provide the terms of those individual investments at that 31st of March position, but that wouldn't necessarily represent the position in terms of the investments throughout the course of the year.
Yeah, if I can come back on that, it does say here they're fixed rate interest. So if they're fixed rate, the interest rate logically is fixed.
Yeah, so that one with Lloyds would be fixed for the...
And Santander. You've said you've got 3 fixed rate investments with Santander totalling 6 million and 1 fixed rate investment of 3 million with Lloyds. Whilst I accept that on demand money the interest rate is normally flexible, when it's a fixed rate, the interest rate and the term is normally known.
Yeah, so it would be fixed for those individual investments.
That's what I'm asking for.
At that point, but I'm just saying that the investment rates may vary throughout the year. Okay.
Councillor Mrs Gadsden.
No, not without a mask.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to understand risk levels. From looking at the 3 banks that we invest with, I would gather that the risk level of the money being invested is fairly low. And I just wondered, I'd really just like to understand what informs your decision on where you invest the money and at what risk level.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so essentially the risk appetite of the council is determined by members as part of the annual Treasury Management Strategy, which is agreed by this committee, as I said, in February prior to it being taken to full council. So the council historically and continues at the moment to have very kind of low risk appetite. So we take advice from our Treasury management advisors who provide kind of colour coding, risk assessments of all different types of investment. And we abide by the kind of limits that we've set ourselves and the colour-coded guidance in terms of the risk of individual investments. But we only tend to invest in banks or money markets, which are very kind of low risk and very low risk indeed compared to other products on the market.
Can I just ask,
Yep.
sorry, so do we have a financial expert that informs members and officers on investments that's outside?
Yeah, we have an external consultant through Link who we procure, so they're investment specialists, treasury management advisors, so we take specialist advice from them and they advise us throughout the year and, as I say, provide the kind of risk matrix which informs our investment decisions.
Just one final question. Do we do comparisons to our investments compared to how other councils' investments strategy is working?
So obviously the kind of investment return will depend on each council's individual risk profile, so they're not necessarily directly comparable, but we do, as part of the service Link provides us, they provide kind of benchmarking information against comparable authorities, and they've kind of said that in comparable terms, our investment rates that we achieve are above average. You know, that we couldn't really achieve any higher investment rates for the level of risk that we're prepared to take.
Oh, thank you for that.
Councillor Dray, please.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is also linked to Link Asset Services, in as much as I would ask a question as to whether we are still happy with their services and whether they're on an annual renewable contract or whether it is a fixed term contract. And have we ever thought about putting their services out to tender? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for your question. So the answer is yes. We procured the service on, I think it's a 3-year contract. I'd have to double check on that, but we did procure it a year or so ago. There's only a limited number of kind of providers that provide a similar service, maybe 2 or 3 sort of key players. But yeah, we do kind of review the service we've received and look at other options at regular intervals.
So when we eventually will go out to tender, will we, to review them?
Potentially, or through a framework which allows us to basically, a framework has been kind of pre-assessed and has preferred kind of suppliers on it, but it's basically a procurement exercise, so there's different ways you can do it, but yeah, we would examine what's available.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. As it clearly explains in 2.2, this report and this function is a delegated function, and you know, you could perhaps describe yourself as somewhat of a passenger on this journey, but it is large amounts of money that we're talking about, and it is part of our ongoing discussions. You could look at 1.4 and describe the performance as disappointing. As Naomi has quite clearly pointed out, trying to project forward in the current climate is really, really challenging, and the rates that are available have been at a lower level, so that as a result of that our budget has not been met. But nevertheless, our performance is quite acceptable, and for a good number of years when we do what benchmarking we can, we do perform fairly consistently above the average. And just a point on the table that's on, or the graph that's on 4.3, where Naomi mentioned the larger amount of money we had at the start of the year. it is just worth note the speed with which we actually got that money out of the door to the businesses in the form of grants that required it in the troubling times. A couple of members have mentioned link services. It's a relatively modest cost per year, and as Naomi said, we did check on the value for money that we achieved from that service a year or so ago. And actually, I do believe it provides good value for money and provides a level of expertise that we could not reasonably be expected to hold within a council of this size. So I believe the report is a good and accurate representation of our treasury management. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Members, there is one recommendation set out at paragraph 9.1 on page 6.4 of the report, sorry, 6.5 of the report. Would those members in favour please raise their hands? Would those members against please raise their hands? Thank you. That vote is unanimous and the recommendation is carried. Thank you.
Chairman.
Yes. Yes, of course. Yep. Moving on to item 7, this is the COVID-19 Lessons Learned and Update report. And Angela Hutchings, the Acting Managing Director, will present this report and will be able to answer any questions. Angela, would you please present your report?
Thank you, Chairman. Members, this is the third report detailing the Council's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, 6 months on from the previous report. In that 6 months, there has been a sea change in the national position, culminating in the Prime Minister readying to move to stage 4 of the COVID roadmap in a little under 2 weeks' time. The key issue for the Council's officers have been, firstly, the continuing requirement to administer central government financial hardship schemes as a new line of service, and secondly, the increase in business as usual services brought about by increased demand and the fact that people are working from home and spending their time locally. This manifests, members, in terms of increase in waste and litter collection, increases in referrals to housing options and revenues and benefits teams, increasing demands on environmental health teams and licensing teams, and increases in domestic planning applications. The Council continues to manage its financial COVID pressures, and the report which was brought to the Executive last month for the Q1 sets out where we are in relation to that, sorry, the year outturn, and is referenced in the financial implications in this report. The Council has adapted to a return to a physical environment for public meetings and the elections, of course, in May, and we are preparing for a 19th July stage 4 lifting of restrictions in relation to our workforce. Response to the staff survey demonstrated the impact of COVID-19 on the workforce, and with a relatively small workforce of 165 people, there are some deep pockets of organisational stress. Some other pockets of resilience, however, but across the board, high levels of work intensity and increased volumes of work presented. Support has been put in place for those employees and has been positively received, but we increased the frequency of internal communications and targeted them specifically to health and well-being to ensure that we continue to talk about the mental health and physical health impacts of COVID-19. The leadership team has put together 7 pledges and an action plan in order to keep the subject current and to respond to the requirements from the staff, to remove cultural barriers to talking about stress, leading from the front in terms of role models, and to look at our leadership and management techniques to find ways to remove stressors in the workplace. and to work hard to continue to create good physical, digital working environment and a work-life balance. In conclusion, the last 6 months of the pandemic have been probably more difficult than the beginning, as although we knew more and we were more experienced and had established a battle rhythm, the longevity of running in emergency mode has been the defining feature of the last 6 months, with energy levels lower than at the beginning, and with the new normal that living with COVID presents. And it remains, Chairman, to be seen how the next 6 months indeed will also pan out. Chairman, this is not an exhaustive report, so if there are other issues which members would like me to bring back to this committee later on in the municipal year, I'll be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any members have questions or observations?
Thank you, Chairman. I have a couple of questions and observations, if that's okay, Chairman. 3.4, actually, sorry, 3.2 first of all. It discussed that there's current offers of support from the hub that was put together during COVID. Could the officer explain and give a little bit more detail on that support? Then 3.4, is the rise directly related to COVID? For example, furloughed residents. 3.9, it's interesting to note, dealt with local outbreaks in a timely fashion. I just wonder what timely fashion actually means in time. And also, with the local outbreaks, is this similar outcome with other councils? And if so, can we influence future occurrences should there be a further outbreak of COVID or similar? And my last question is on 5.2. The officer mentioned that there are barriers and stigma around mental health. Now, when staff are accessing the employee assistant programme, one, do we know the take-up? And I'm hoping that it is confidential, and although numbers may be provided to the council, not necessarily staff details. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. That's quite a lot. If I can just bear with me while I just go through it. So taking those in order, in relation to paragraph 3.2 and the continuing support provided by the hub. So the hub has, as you know, was essentially a partnership between Rochford District Council and a number of voluntary sector partners as we moved through the first phase of the pandemic and towards the second lockdown period. The ownership, effectively, of that hub moved from the council towards the to the community support, and they took over and began to own and run it in terms of mobilising support and the volunteer network. Continuing to work in partnership with the council and reporting to the Health and Wellbeing Board. The ongoing work it remains exemplar, and as it says in that paragraph, Essex County Council is looking to continue to support that work. It remains the case that the bonds that have been built by the volunteers and those who were supported amongst the clinically vulnerable have remained to be incredibly strong. And so the informal networks that continue to provide help, support, shopping, prescriptions and general befriending continues. notwithstanding the actual hub itself. So the networks are across very strong, and indeed from the church network in particular, in relation to how that community support continues. So it is remaining. In relation to paragraph 3.4, the question was asked whether the number of approaches to the council housing option service was directly related to COVID-19. Chairman, I can't answer that question forensically this evening, but I can take that away if that would suffice. But certainly it is the increase is directly as a consequence of COVID-19, although I can't say whether it is linked to furloughs, etc. But it is, for example, we saw displacements created by, certainly during lockdown periods, through domestic violence and through other strained family situations where people presented as homeless. In paragraph 3.9, the question was asked about how the environmental health team resolving cases in a timely fashion. The issue for the council's environmental health team as part of the second tier response to Essex County Council's first tier track and trace was to follow up local contacts across the district as information was given to us. I can't give you an average turnaround time, although again I can take that away and ask that question for you. But the team, in terms of providing timely fashion, is to contact trace and provide that information back to Essex County Council so that the NHS Test and Trace team could reach out and make contact to them, and isolation periods could begin. So it was, as I certainly know that there were occasions when information wasn't provided to us as quickly as it might otherwise have been, but that the team then capitalised on that and tried to make up for lost time by getting out there as quickly as possible. In terms of our response, are similar to other councils and can we influence, the environmental health team were part of a 24-hour, 7 days a week rota, along with district council colleagues from across the county. So the response was pretty uniform. Some authorities have more available officers than others, and a number of our environmental health team were in fact actually clinically vulnerable and were shielding. So we were part of a joint effort across the county. So certainly in terms of ongoing influence, I expect very much that the dependency on the environmental health colleagues at second tier councils will continue. The Prime Minister made direct reference to continuing track and trace, regardless of what life looks like after the 19th of July. So we absolutely are part of that, and that team meets weekly with the Director of Public Health, and information is provided and cascaded to that team in relation to local outbreaks and how to manage them. The environmental health team already had an extremely good working relationship with businesses, and during certainly the peak of the pandemic, they were working with businesses consistently to ensure that those that were able to operate could operate safely, and those that were prohibited from opening remained closed. And as we've moved through the unlocking process, in conjunction with colleagues from licensing, the environmental health team has continued to take a really proactive approach to working with businesses to help them reopen safely and to give confidence to shoppers and to residents to continue to use those services, but equally has not shied away from bringing enforcement action when required to do so. But it has been very much the exception rather than the rule, and the continuing approach appears to be one of, again, working on those good working relationships. The next question, Chairman, that was asked was in relation to the Employee Assistance Programme. So yes, the Employee Assistance Programme has been in place for quite some considerable time. It predates the pandemic and is a a response which the council has offered for several years now. We do know that it was taken up. It includes free counselling services for employees, and of course, yes, it is absolutely confidential. We have a mental health first aider who's been providing support. We've seen that that person has not been as well received as the Employee Assistance Scheme, simply because they are another member of staff, and we as a council, I think, are too small, and therefore that issue of confidence, I think, is a barrier to accessing the mental health first aider. So what we're looking to do is to work with another authority to effectively buddy up with somebody from outside the organisation, so that there's somebody entirely independent with whom officers can speak if they would like to do so. And Chairman, I think those are the questions that were asked.
Thank you. Just one, not question, but an ask, please, Angela. On 3.2.
Yep.
On 3.2, the Rochester District Community Hub therefore continues with partners to develop current offers of support. If we could have some feedback on what those offers of support are, just so that we can see any remaining sort of gaps in provision in our community.
No problem, Chairman.
Thank you so much for a very comprehensive report. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask the officer through you to expand slightly on 3.4. I think Councillor Mrs McPherson's raised a very important question, but the table that we've been shown, it only goes up to March, and yet it says we're expecting an increase following the removal of the rental eviction moratorium on the 1st of June 21. We're now on the 6th of July. When would we expect to have the last quarter's figures? It's over a month now.
Chairman, Louisa Moss, Assistant Director for People and Communities, provides a quarterly update which is provided to members, so I'd expect that information to be in there, but I can ask her to provide it to this committee outside of this meeting.
Yeah, I think it would have been helpful in this report, Mr. Chairman, to have up-to-date information. And just one other slight question. 3.13, we say that the South Street Customer Reception has reinstated face-to-face services for our customers on an appointment basis. Do we know what the demand for that has been?
The demand has been steady and consistent in that appointments offered have been accepted, but it hasn't yet been overwhelmed. Following the 19th of July, when we reopen reception with a receptionist, we'll be doing much more information gathering and data analysis to make sure we understand how many people are actually coming onto site.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Mrs Shaw. I can't hear you.
Lauren, you may wish to switch that one off. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, if I can ask Angela a question on 3.2 again. The hub, you say it's going well, but I'm getting various phone calls for asking me if I can provide volunteers to help people with shopping, etc. So it looks like they may be losing some of their volunteers. So could you get their stuff clarify that, please? Thank you.
Yes, I will. I mean, there was always an inevitability in terms of losing volunteers as people return to the workplace. But yes, I can get some further information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Members, if you'll indulge me, I've just got one question really for the officer, which is, from what we've learned so far from the pandemic, how do you see the future working patterns for our staff?
The information that we have from the staff surveys shows that predominantly the agile working policy has been successful, and officers like the flexibility of being able to manage their workload and their location, work being something that you do, not necessarily somewhere that you go. But there is equally a demand for coming onto site, not just for seeing clients, but also for undertaking peer support work and working collaboratively as part of the team. And what is clear is that social isolation is equally destructive, as is the risk of COVID in a larger environment. I'm expecting to see a gradual drift back to the South Street offices as confidence increases and as teams become used to working together again, and that will be a very positive thing to see. But we are seeing that in terms of managing the work-life balance, the agile working policy, with a new flexi time policy that we're bringing in as well, is meeting most of our officers' requirements. We have to be careful on guard against a sort of an extra hours kind of culture, where it's difficult for officers to separate out their working environment and being at home. And if you are working from home all the time, that's actually very difficult to manage. So working in a hybrid fashion going forward seems to be the conclusion of the staff survey. And there are some teams, for example, the Revenues and Benefits team and the Planning team, where working collaboratively with colleagues actually creates a better product. It provides peer support, allows people to bounce ideas from one another, and generally it means that the sort of an internal quality assurance takes place, which is very difficult to do when you're working by yourself, whereas there are other officers for whom that's less of an issue. Many of our officers continue to work from site as they have done throughout. Our licensing team, for example, continues to see taxi drivers and other applicants in a COVID-secure way, although they were one of the first in the county to pioneer digital ways of working. So the creativity and innovation that the pandemic has caused, I think, means that we can pick out the good bits that we would like to take going forward, but I think the mandate that they need no longer work from home will be positively received.
Thank you. Members, there's one recommendation at paragraph 14.1 on page 7.12 of the report, which is to note the report. Is the report noted, members? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
We now move on to item 8, which is the key decisions document. And what I intend to do is to go through a page at a time. And if anyone has any questions or observations on any of the items, please let me know. So on page 2, we've got the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 and the suspension of parking charges on Saturdays before Christmas. Any observations or comments? Thank you. We move on to page 3, and we've got the Voluntary Sector Grant Allocation 2022 to 2023 and the Connect Programme Investor Save Business Case and Pipeline of Projects. Any comments or observations? Thank you. Move on to page 4, which is the Association of South Essex Local Authorities and the Parks for Nature. Any observations or comments? Okay, thank you. And then on page 5, we've got the waste transfer arrangements. Any observations or comments? Okay, thank you, members. We now move on to item 9, which is the work plan. And we've got the published work plan, which is as from the last meeting. But we've currently got an existing working group, which is the Open Spaces Working Group, which Councillor Mr Shaw and Councillor Mrs Mason, and in fact Councillor Sperring are members of. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Councillor Mrs Mason if she could give a quick verbal update on the work of the group, please.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Yes, I'm happy to do that. The Open Spaces Management Working Group was formulated, I think it was back in 2019. In January 20, the working group asked officers for 4 items of information. The lack of response to these requests in a timely fashion and the changes the subsequent pandemic created led to a delay in the group setting up a further meeting. Towards the end of last year, these items were chased and some information was provided, including a report that, although not requested, had been commissioned by officers and was informative and helpful. However, although requested, the group has not received the information regarding the cost of that report to date. Despite the lack of resources, the working group reconvened after the election, and we have managed, with our officer administration, to move forward relatively quickly. And the working group is working well in this different format. I would like to thank all members participating for their constructive input and willingness to embrace a new way of working. And I would mention again that the names of those members, because they have been very constructive: Councillor Phil Shaw, Councillor Michael Hoy, Councillor David Sperring, and the Chairman himself, of course. The Open Spaces, tongue-tied there. The Open Spaces Management Working Group is in the process of drafting a report which will be presented to this committee for consideration and subsequent presentation to full council. It is anticipated that this will be ready for the September meeting. A recommendation from the Open Spaces Working Group is as follows: that the problem of the historic sites be addressed by a separate working group, with a suggestion that this be done on a site-by-site basis, and that consideration is given to the Burrs estate at first, as there are known issues. We did find, Mr Chairman, that the complexity of 2 competing ideologies was probably not helping the group. So that's the meaning behind that recommendation. So I'd like that added onto the work plan if the committee so agrees. And hopefully we will, as I say, be able to give you a full report in September.
Thank you. Members, from my perspective, this group works really well. Not because I'm on it, in spite of me being on it, I would say. But it's very flexible. It's a good way of working. What it does is it means that members are actively involved, and it minimises the load that we put onto officers. So rather than have overloading officers and having them at beck and call, it means that it's truly member-led. I don't want to put you on the spot, Councillor Mr Shaw, but what's your perception of it?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, so we've met twice. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the first meeting. I wasn't able to go to the first meeting, but the second one, everybody seems to be working well together. And the last meeting we agreed to go away and look at one subject, and we're all going to come back and then discuss that subject. But it is working well. Without, as you say, without the officers' input, we've managed to do a lot ourselves, and we can go back and recommend things to this committee when we've got everything together. But it is working really good.
Okay, thanks. And I don't want you to get the impression that there is no officer involvement at all. There is. But what we're trying to do is minimise the load on the officers so that we can cover more ground by doing that.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a question. Chairman. Is there an officer that takes minutes at the meeting, just for the records?
No. But it doesn't mean to say they couldn't be. It's just that it's almost a self-managing working group.
I,
Yep. Councillor Mrs Mason, yeah.
For clarity, minutes are not kept, but notes are kept of the meeting and are circulated and agreed. So they're not formal minutes. Working groups don't tend to have formal minutes anyway, but they're kept by a member of the group. But as it happens, I'm keeping them. I circulate them almost straight away. If anyone has any any further input into those notes or want them altered, then that is done. So that it's a very collaborative way of working. But it doesn't have to be myself as chairman that's actually doing that. Any member of the group could do that if they so wished. But notes are kept and are on record.
thank you for clarifying that. I'm just mindful that perhaps within the office there should be some sort of record of these meetings, so perhaps those minutes are passed on to an officer.
You could do, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. And as a principle, I would like to establish more of these working groups through the year. And there's a couple of areas that have been suggested for work. One is around the Section 106 work, which is from the initial concept and outline of what Section 106 is going to provide in a development through to the actual implementation, because sometimes what members are saying to me is what's delivered isn't always what was agreed at the development committee. So it's perhaps looking at those arrangements. And also something which is quite topical is the processes around how assets are released to third parties from council to perhaps town or parish councils, perhaps charities or to community groups. So those are the sorts of flavours of topics. I'm just waiting for the ADs to get back to me so that we can actually formally scope that. And what I intend to do is out of committee is to write to members to see whether you're interested in being a member on any of those working groups. So that's the way that I would like to work. One thing I would say is don't overload yourself. If it turns out there's lots of these working groups going on, don't overload yourself and end up doing nothing and chasing your tail. Go for things that you're interested in. Are there any questions on the working groups, member working groups? Okay, thank you. That is the final agenda item, so I declare the meeting closed at 20:18. Thank you, members.